One morning in March 1899, Edward Henry Harriman walked briskly into the Washington office of C. Hart Merriam, chief of the U.S. Biological Survey, and proposed something that sounded, on the surface, like a rest. He was exhausted. His doctor had told him so. For 2 years, he had been engineering the resurrection of the Union Pacific Railroad, one of the most financially ruined institutions in America, turning it, through sheer force of will and uncommon intelligence, into a profitable empire. By 1899, he controlled more miles of American track than almost any other man alive. His doctor told him he needed a long vacation. His idea of a long vacation was to charter a 250-foot ocean steamship, refit it with lecture halls and a 500-volume library and taxidermy studios, and sail it to the last unmapped coastline in North America, Alaska. And he wanted company, not family friends, scientists, the best in the country, across every relevant discipline, assembled in 3 weeks on Merriam's personal recommendation. In the end, 25 men of science boarded the SS George W. Elder in Seattle on May 31st, 1899, alongside artists, photographers, writers, hunters, taxidermists, a chaplain, and the entire Harriman family. 126 people in total, cheered off the dock by large crowds, while newspapers around the world ran front-page stories about the most glamorous scientific expedition anyone had seen. Among them, John Muir, who had already walked every significant glacier in Alaska and had been writing about them for 20 years. Henry Gannett, the chief geographer of the United States Geological Survey, the man who had produced more accurate maps of American terrain than anyone then living. G. K. Gilbert, the preeminent geologist of his generation. Edward Curtis, 26 years old and barely known, in the earliest days of what would become the most ambitious photographic project in American history. And George Bird Grinnell, editor of Forest and Stream and the country's most respected authority on Native American culture. The official story of why Harriman organized this expedition is that he wanted to hunt Kodiak bears. He did want that. He got his bear at Kodiak Island, guided by the legendary frontier scout Luther Kelly. But here is the question that nobody writing about the trip in 1899 asked loudly enough. Why does a railroad magnate in the specific business of Western expansion spend his own money, a fortune by any measure, sending 25 scientists to survey 9,000 miles of Alaskan coastline? What exactly was he hoping they would find? What the expedition's geographers were specifically tasked with mapping? What they found in Prince William Sound that wasn't on any existing chart? And why Henry Gannett had to redraw the maps before the ship even returned to Seattle. Alaska in 1899 was not a state. It was not even a formal territory. The United States had purchased it from Russia 32 years earlier for $7.2 million, a transaction so widely mocked at the time that it was called Seward's Folly, and had since administered it as a district with a presidential-appointed governor and very little else. What the country had not done, in 3 decades of ownership, was survey it properly. The coastline charts that existed in 1899 were largely based on Russian surveys from decades prior. American geological maps of the interior were fragmentary at best. The glaciers, which dominated the southern coastal terrain and directly controlled which valleys and inlets were navigable, which were frozen shut, which had retreated enough to open passage, were almost entirely unmapped in real time. They were advancing or retreating constantly, and nobody had a systematic record of where any of them currently stood. This mattered enormously to anyone interested in building a railroad. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 and 1898 had transformed American thinking about Alaska almost overnight. Suddenly, the question was not whether Alaska had economic value. The gold pouring out of the Yukon had answered that. But how to access it? How to move men and equipment and extracted wealth in and out of a territory that, for most of the year, was accessible only by sea? The answer to anyone who had made a fortune in railroads was obvious. You needed a rail line. The question was where to build one, and that question could not be answered without knowing what the terrain actually looked like. Henry Gannett was aboard the George W. Elder as the expedition's official geographer. His job was to produce accurate coastal charts. While the ship's scientists went ashore at each stop to collect specimens, measure glaciers, and catalogue species, Gannett was taking readings, triangulating positions, and correcting errors in the existing charts that had been accumulating for 30 years of inadequate Russian-era cartography. The glaciological surveys were conducted primarily by G.K. Gilbert, and they produced something that no one had systematically documented before: a precise, comparative record of where the major southern Alaskan glaciers stood in 1899, measured against earlier accounts, charted to the foot. What Gilbert and Gannett found, stop by stop along the route, was that the maps were wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. Coastlines that earlier charts showed as solid ice were open water. Inlets that had been marked as blocked by glacial terminus were navigable. The terrain was not what anyone had assumed, because the terrain was moving, and moving fast. John Muir had first surveyed Glacier Bay in 1879. He returned in 1880. By 1899, when the George W. Elder dropped anchor there, the ice had retreated so dramatically in 20 years that Muir could barely recognize it. The glacier that bore his name had pulled back 1.6 miles in 19 years. And the map Henry Gannett drew during those June days in 1899, showing the successive positions of the Muir Glacier front at multiple historical dates, was the first document to make the scale of that retreat scientifically legible. The landscape was not static. Every map that showed it as static was a lie. The most dramatic illustration of this came in Prince William Sound in late June 1899. The George W. Elder was working its way through the Sound when the expedition, following the shoreline of Barry Arm, noticed something. The face of the Barry Glacier, a massive tidewater glacier that previous charts showed extending all the way across the mouth of a narrow inlet, had pulled back just far enough to open a navigable channel along one side. A gap, barely enough for a ship, but enough. Harriman himself insisted they try it. The Elder threaded through, past the blue-green face of the glacier, through water that had been solid ice when any existing chart of this region was drawn. And on the other side, they found a 15-mile-long fjord that was not on any map anywhere. A fjord full of glaciers, college-sized rivers of ice carving into water so cold and clear that the overboard depth readings came back wrong. A body of water that no expedition, no survey, no document in any language had ever recorded. They named it Harriman Fjord. They mapped it on the spot. Henry Gannett produced the first chart of its entrance. G.K. Gilbert surveyed the Columbia Glacier at the far end of Prince William Sound. taking readings from June 25th to 28th that would serve as the baseline measurement against which the Columbia Glacier's retreat would be tracked for the next century. The maps were being redrawn in real time, literally, on a ship's table while the expedition moved north. 13 new genera, nearly 600 new species, 38 new fossil species, 9 species of algae previously unknown to science, 8,000 documented insect specimens, including a species, the glacial worm, that had never been catalogued, a new glacier, a new fjord, a coastline corrected to match the landscape that actually existed, rather than the one that earlier, colder decades had frozen in place. This was scientific work. It was extraordinary. It was also, for the man funding all of it, a very useful thing to know. But the surveyors found something else along the route, something that wasn't in any scientific report. A discovery that the expedition's most famous passenger refused to stay silent about, and that a century of subsequent history would confirm was noticed, taken, and never adequately accounted for. On July the 26th, 1899, as the George W. Elder was making its return run south towards Seattle, Edward Harriman directed the ship into a small bay near Cape Fox, about 50 miles southeast of Ketchikan. A painter named Frederick Dellenbaugh had told him about it. A veteran gold miner on Kodiak had roughed out a penciled map. There was, reportedly, a Tlingit village in that bay worth seeing. A village that had been abandoned for several years. The community had relocated to be closer to a school and a Presbyterian church, founding what is now known as Saxman, but whose structures and monuments remained intact. Totem poles, house fronts, cultural objects accumulated over generations. What the expedition found at the village of Gash was something that the scientists on board immediately recognized as extraordinary. Towering totem poles, some of them 40 feet tall, carved with figures of extraordinary complexity. House panels painted in the formal, two-dimensional style of Tlingit art. Objects of every description, left behind not because they were abandoned, but because the community intended to return for them, or because the poles were too large and too sacred to be moved casually. What Harriman and most of the expedition did next is well documented, and it is the moment the story changes. They loaded the objects onto the ship. House fronts, totem poles, housewares, dozens of cultural items taken from a village whose community was very much alive, living 50 miles away, fully aware that the objects were there. The ship rode lower in the water, leaving Cape Fox than it had arriving. John Muir refused. He called it looting. He refused to be photographed with the objects. He could not stop what was happening, but he would not be part of it, and he said so clearly enough that his objection was recorded. The expedition members who participated justified it as rescue, as the preservation of material that would otherwise decay from a culture they presumed to be dying. The same logic, note, that had justified Hrdlicka's collecting at the Smithsonian. The same logic that would underpin a century of institutional collecting from indigenous communities. The objects were distributed to museums, the Smithsonian, Harvard, Cornell, the Field Museum in Chicago, the University of Washington. They entered collections. They were labeled, accessioned, and placed in storage. And there they remained for 102 years. In 2001, a new expedition retraced the route of the 1899 voyage. Scientists, historians, and descendants of the original Harriman family sailed the same coastline, stopped at the same places, and documented a century of change. At Cape Fox, they held a ceremony. 4 totem poles and more than a dozen objects were returned to the Tlingit people of the Cape Fox community, the descendants of the residents of Gash. Anthropologist Rosita Wall, herself a Tlingit and a member of the 2001 expedition, described the moment in terms that cut through a century of institutional language. The objects that were coming back, she said, were not merely cultural artifacts, they were ancestors. She could feel, she said, the happiness and relief of the spirits. It had taken 102 years to sort through what the expedition had done in an afternoon. But even now, even with the returns, the science, the redrawn maps, the 14 volumes of published findings, the full story of what Harriman's surveyors found isn't complete. Because the most important thing the expedition documented, without fully understanding it, was a warning. A warning about what was already happening to the landscape they had spent 2 months mapping. And that warning would not be clearly read for another century. In the 13 volumes of the Harriman Alaska series, published by Doubleday beginning in 1901 and running to over 3,000 pages of scientific findings, the glacier observations occupy a disproportionate amount of space. That is not an accident. The glaciologists on board, Gilbert and Muir above all, understood that what they were seeing in 1899 was not a stable landscape momentarily photographed. It was a landscape mid-transformation, and the direction of that transformation was consistent and alarming. At Glacier Bay, where Muir had stood on ice in 1879 and found open water 20 years later, the retreat was not a curiosity. It was a measurement, a rate, a trend that the 1899 surveys made possible to quantify for the first time. Henry Gannett's map of the Muir Glacier showed the glacier's front position at multiple historical dates, drawn as successive lines on the same chart. Those lines, each one representing the furthest forward point of a river of ice at a specific year, told a story that every geologist who looked at the map could read immediately. The glacier was retreating, had been retreating for decades, was retreating faster than the rate of earlier years. G.K. Gilbert's survey of the Columbia Glacier in Prince William Sound, taken from June 25th to 28th, established a baseline that subsequent researchers would return to again and again throughout the 20th century. By the late 1980s, the Columbia Glacier had retreated nearly 10 miles from the position Gilbert recorded in 1899. The bay that his chart showed as partially open in 1899 was now wide open, choked with icebergs carving from a terminus that was, in geological time, sprinting backward. The expedition did not cause this, but it documented it, precisely and systematically, at a moment when no other documentation existed. It gave future scientists a fixed point from which to measure everything that came after. What the surveyors found along the Alaska route in 1899, beneath all the new species and the redrawn fjords and the extraordinary scientific production of a 2-month coastal voyage, was a coastline already in the process of becoming something other than what any existing map showed. The ice was moving. The land underneath it was being revealed. The channels that had been blocked were opening. And one of those opened channels led 15 miles into an unmapped fjord, directly to a question that nobody in 1899 was yet asking. What happens to this landscape when the ice that defines it is no longer there? The 13 volumes of the Harriman Alaska series took a decade to produce. 50 specialists catalogued, edited, and published the findings. When the final volumes appeared, they represented the most comprehensive scientific account of any American territory ever produced from a single expedition. They became a landmark, the standard reference for Alaskan coastal geography, biology, geology, and anthropology for decades. Henry Gannett's charts corrected the coastline. The surveys of Harriman Fjord and Columbia Glacier established baselines that scientists are still using today, 125 years later, to measure the rate of glacial retreat that the 1899 expedition was the first to document systematically. Every subsequent survey of the southern Alaskan coast has been calibrated against the measurements Gannett and Gilbert took from the deck and shore parties of the George W. Elder. That is the scientific legacy. It is profound and it is real. But the expedition also produced something else, something less celebrated and more complicated. It produced a set of photographs, 5,000 of them. Edward Curtis's camera captured the landscapes, the glaciers, the wildlife, and the people. The Tlingit and Aleut communities the ship visited along its route, photographed at a moment when their way of life was already being reshaped by the same forces of American expansion that Harriman himself represented. Those images are among the earliest systematic photographic records of Alaska Native peoples in existence. And on the same ship that carried those photographs north on the return journey were the totem poles and house fronts from Cape Fox. This is the expedition's real complexity, the one that the 14 volumes of scientific findings do not fully contain. It was, simultaneously, one of the most important acts of American scientific documentation and one of the most vivid examples of the entitled collecting that characterized the Gilded Age's relationship to indigenous culture. The same voyage, the same ship, the same men. John Muir's refusal to pose with the stolen poles was not forgotten, but it was also not enough. It is the gesture of a man who understood that something wrong was happening and found himself unable to stop it, which is, perhaps, the most honest position any single person aboard that ship could have occupied. The railroad that Harriman was almost certainly scouting never bore his name. He died in 1909. The Alaska Railroad was eventually built by the federal government, authorized by Congress in 1914, constructed along the route from Seward to Fairbanks that the 1899 surveys had helped make comprehensible. The cities that grew along that route, including the tent city that sprang up at the mouth of Ship Creek in 1915 and became Anchorage, owe something, however indirect, to the geographers who stood on the deck of the George W. Elder and measured for the first time what the land actually looked like. The maps Harriman's surveyors drew in 1899 have been revised many times since. The glaciers that defined those maps have retreated so far that several of the charts are barely recognizable against modern aerial photography. Harriman Fjord is still there, still named, the fjord that didn't exist on any map until a railroad tycoon threaded a steamship through a gap in the ice, and a geographer drew what was on the other side. On the wall of the Cape Fox Cultural Foundation, the community descended from the people whose village the expedition entered in July 1899. There is a record of the objects that were taken and eventually returned. The totem poles that came home in 2001, after a century in museum storage, were re-raised in ceremony. The spirits, a Tlingit elder said, were relieved. That is the full record of what Harriman's surveyors found. A coastline redrawn, 600 species newly named, a fjord brought onto the map, and, On the return leg, an afternoon in a bay near Cape Fox that took 102 years to properly account for. The maps were redrawn. They are still being redrawn.